Hello, folks. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. In this video segment, I want to discuss with you some important work that was just completed and published. It was published in the journal Elements. And what this report looked at was humankind's carbon output. Now, you're probably going to say, okay, what's so different about this? Well, what's really cool is that the scientists have been able to separate out the CO2 put into the atmosphere by human activities, such as burning fossil fuels, versus what goes into the atmosphere from volcanic actions, volcanic fissures. They're able to tell the difference. And they say, oh, volcanoes contributed this much, humans contributed this much. Very important. Helps separate things. And as we're going to discuss later on, it helps in our understanding of the carbon budget. So scientists now know how much CO2 is pumped into the atmosphere and oceans by volcanoes and volcanic fissures annually, perhaps as much as 360 million tons. And another crucial statistic, human output, humankind's carbon output. They have now been able to measure that by burning fossil fuels and clearing forests, building cities, humans emit much more than that, between 40 and 100 times more. So if you have 360 million tons and you multiply that by 100, that's 36,000 million tons. And if you multiply that by 40 on the low end, that's 14,400 million tons. If I did my math correctly in my head. Okay. The point is, we're doing a lot more than natural processes. So when people start, the climate deniers start saying, well, it could be, you say, bullshit. We got the data that shows and demonstrates humans are doing the great majority of the damage of putting the CO2 up in there. With this new study, scientists are also able now to indicate how much carbon is in circulation above the Earth's surface, how much is in the ocean, how much is on land, right? Obviously in the atmosphere, of course. And the answer is 43,500 billion tons, okay? The numbers I was citing before were million ton. This is now billion tons, so it's 3 orders of magnitude more. That's about 0.2% of all the carbon locked for the moment in the Earth's crust, mantle, and core. Let's stop and think about that for a moment. 43,500 billion tons, which is about 0.2%. So if you multiply that out, that's 0.002 of all the carbon locked for the moment in the Earth's crust, mantle, and core. Now, stuff that hasn't been extracted yet, stuff that hasn't been released yet. So right now, what's in the Earth's crust, mantle, and core is now a carbon sink. And if we leave it there, it stays as a sink. If we go after it, releasing it becomes a source. Just like the permafrost historically has been a carbon sink, is now becoming a carbon source. So this is one of the major aspects that climate scientists have been trying to get a handle on, especially when they want to construct a carbon budget to better understand the carbon cycle, is, how much is in, the bedrock. So think of this as an accounting problem, right? So you have carbon that's cycled between the atmosphere, the ocean, the rocks, organisms. So this research helps scientists get a better handle on the carbon budget, the carbon cycling, etc. So a partnership of more than 500 scientists from 39 countries working on more than 100 separate projects came up with this monumental report that was published in the journal Elements. This is after a decade of research. I alluded to in an earlier video segment how this is good that scientists are now doing more collaborative, more comprehensive collaborative efforts. Now, the numbers I cited, of course, are an estimate, and subject to changes. It depends on the errors, depending on the sampling, the methodology, the measurement, and so on. But it's a good starting point. So this total estimate for the entire stock of carbon at the surface and the crust and Earth's mantle is around 1.85 billion tons. So that's 1.85 times 10 to the 18th, basically. The observations of volcanic discharges of carbon are vital to understanding the cycle. Carbon from the atmosphere, of course, is absorbed by forests. Okay? And other plants could be buried, it could be respired, moved along from trophic level to trophic level. Okay? It can be buried as a shell if carbon gets incorporated as say calcite, calcium carbonate, for example, in the organisms, calcium phosphate. You get the idea. So it can be incorporated into organisms. It can be buried in the ground. If an organism dies and it gets buried, it's sequestered out. Okay? And of course, then we have the coal, oil, gas, and so on. Methane gas, of course, and then you've got the permafrost. Carbon that is lost to the atmosphere can be steadily replenished by deep, hot sources from the Earth's crust. For example, what takes place is the subduction zone, the rift zone. The subduction zone can take carbon out of the system, but the rift zone reintroduce it. You have the hydrothermal vents, the black smokers. There's another way for carbon to be reintroduced into the system, because it gets introduced into the ocean, but it could eventually make its way up to the surface and into the atmosphere. The study also highlights the nature of the climate emergency by mining, drilling, or quarrying for fossil fuels with which to drive, operate, chainsaws, for example. You want to chop down a forest to clear for agriculture, or to get the wood products and for lumber to build houses, make paper, what have you. Or if you want to bake limestone to make cement. So basically, of course, humans are returning the ancient deposit of these fossil carbon back to the atmosphere at an extremely alarming rate. As I discussed in an earlier segment, most of human history, human ancestors evolved in a low carbon atmosphere, like around 230 parts. But in the last 60 years, basically we've almost doubled it. So now there is an interesting partnership that researchers formed called the Deep Carbon Observatory. And they have basically added much to this fundamental knowledge of the carbon cycle, the carbon budget, how much is done by volcanoes, humans, and so on. Everything I've reported to you thus far. And as well as figuring out, okay, what is not known, what needs to be further ascertained. And because of this work, they now have a better idea of the carbon's natural cycle. So Marie Edmonds of the University of Cambridge in the UK, which is one of the partnerships here, she states that carbon is the basis of all life and energy source vital to humanity. It moves through the planet from its mantle to the atmosphere. To secure a sustainable future, it is of utmost importance that we understand Earth's entire carbon cycle. Key to unraveling the planet's natural carbon cycle is quantifying how much carbon there is and where, how much moves, which we call flux in science, and how quickly, from reservoirs deep in the earth to the surface and perhaps back again. Now, when we talk about flux, flux is a way to measure a flow rate of something. Now, if any of you studied calculus, and you introduced to this in typically Calc 3, where you perform a triple integral over a basically over a gradient, and then you can ascertain the rate of movement. So you could have, for example, a sphere, and you could have flux out of the entire surface of the sphere. Well, the surface area of the sphere is 4 pi r squared. Okay, if you have a cylinder, right, you can measure the flux out of the entire cylinder, or perhaps a portion of the cylinder. So we call movements of material, we call it flux. So for example, in oceanography, when we talk about 1 sphere drop of water movement, that's 10 to the 6 cubic meters of seawater flowing past a point per second. That's a flux. Okay, it could be horizontal, it could be vertical. Okay, usually sphere drops are more horizontal flows, but you get the idea. So flux is basically a measure of how much material, so much of this material per, say, cubic meter per second, or it could be per hour. So with flux, you need a concentration of a material as well as its rate of movement per some unit time. And usually it can be a scalar calculation, or it can be a vector calculation. Vector calculation, you specify a direction. But that's what a flux is. It's a way to measure a concentration of whatever it is of interest, movement per unit of time. So, the observatory recently identified a huge volume of subterranean life far below the planet's surface. Now, I've discussed before how when there's loads of bacteria in the Earth's mantle, in fact, when you look at the biomass of bacteria, which are prokaryotic organisms, it is greater than all the eukaryotic organisms of the planet combined. That's your trees, your whales, fungi, even your protistans. They may be unicellular, but they are still considered eukaryotic because they have a defined nucleus with a nuclear membrane. They have organelles in the cell, cytoplasm, so on. So now that we've identified these life deep in the Earth's below the planet's surface, well, a deep crust into the upper mantle, that now needs to be accounted for, and we now need to get better measures on that so we can improve our understanding of the carbon budget and cycle. So this will be another area of research. So this work is just a start, but it's important to plan ahead what needs to be done, and I've just mentioned one of the areas of research. So the scientists are now looking for new ways to assess, for example, vegetation uptake. We want to assess the role of microbes in world soil. I've done several video segments where I basically say don't neglect what microbes do. So look at vegetation uptake, what the role of microbes in the soils do, the interaction between carbon, rivers, for example. And the same study provided some more information on the periodic role of volcanic magma discharges, as they wrote in the paper, difficult to predict events in disrupting life on Earth. At least 4 times in the past 500 million years, enormous discharges of carbon have changed climates and triggered mass extinction, one of them being the Permian. And then, of course, you had the big old rock tumbling out of the sky about 66 million years or so ago, causing the end of the non-avian dinosaur reign on the planet, basically bringing the Mesozoic to a close, the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary. Okay. And so this research will continue, and I look forward to new information that they're able to ascertain. So this is interesting. We're getting better information, better handle on humans' contribution versus the natural contributions of what's happening to the carbon budget, the carbon levels, and as far as in the carbon cycle itself. Thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.